Welcome everybody, those who have joined us for this lecture by Peter Johnston, and obviously those who have returned or stayed. This lecture is part of a series of events run by the History and Heritage Research theme at the School of Modern Languages, represented here today by its academic lead, Dr. Russell Mead, who will later manage the question and answer part at the end of Peter's talk. At the same time, this lecture is part of the three-day conference Repensando Malvinas, Rethinking Falklands. This is the second day of that event. Dr. Peter Johnston is a military historian and museum professional. He's currently the head of collections and research at the Royal Air Force Museum. Prior to taking up this role, he was the head of collections, research, and academic access at the National Army Museum in London, which he joined in 2014. Peter spends the majority of his time conducting research and working with academics and the military. He has acted as an expert and accompanying academic on battlefield tours from Flanders to the Falklands, as well as regularly appearing across media channels. His first book, British Forces in Germany, The Lived Experience, was the authorized history of the British forces in Germany from 1945 to 2019, published by Profile Editions in October 2019. He has also published on recruitment, propaganda, and museum collections. Peter studied history and modern history for his undergraduate and master's degrees at the University of Durham, and completed his PhD at the University of Kent, focusing on recruitment and culture in the British Armed Forces. He has previously worked as an assistant lecturer at the University of Kent, visiting lecturer at the University of Westminster, and as a researcher in social policy. And Peter's talk today is titled Picking Your Battles, Exhibiting the Falklands-Malvinas War in Military Museums. And with that, I'm pleased to hand over to Dr. Peter Johnston.
Thank you, Tilman. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, buen dia. It's really great to be able to join you. Good morning from Tucson, Arizona, which is where I currently am on attachment from work. But thank you very much for hosting me and allowing me to offer my thoughts and reflections on what is ultimately a work in progress, namely how the memory of the Falklands-Malvinas conflict has been exhibited in military museums here in the UK. From a historian and practitioner's perspective, I hope to provide an insight to some of the challenges and opportunities represented by presenting the conflict in British military museums. Now, the events of 1982 continue to cast a long shadow, and while public recognition varies, one place the conflict endures is in the UK's military museums. Museums sit in the space between myths, truths, and complications, but must engage with all three if they are to analyse and discuss war and conflict effectively. This paper will explore how military museums have presented the South Atlantic conflict and how audiences have responded. Yet the continued display of this conflict poses many challenges for military museums. There are challenges of space, of resources, of relevance. There are problems posed for museums and audiences and the nature of the exhibits themselves. Since June 1982, there have been tensions and contestations in the history of the war, which show no signs of abating. These challenges to the UK narrative extend to museum exhibitions, and this tension will be explored. With 2022 being the 40th anniversary, this paper will analyse how this is being marked by military museums and how this is the catalyst for new displays, acquisitions, or public engagement. And I'll show you some examples of projects that have already been launched towards the end of my paper. This will demonstrate how the presentation of the Falklands-Malvinas is not static, but ever-evolving, dynamic, and challenging. An important note on some of the terms I'll be using and that are relevant here. I've chosen to highlight military museums as part of this paper, as that is a particularly broad term. The Falklands-Malvinas conflict is presented in many museums that are not exclusively military museums or even exclusively war museums here in the UK. In fact, here, or rather over there in the UK, where I normally am, the main museum that serves as a memorial to war is the Imperial War Museum in Lambeth in London and its associated satellite sites. Museums such as mine and those are the other service museums, while military museums are not war museums, nor are they memorials, but repositories of memory. Now, this is a subtle difference, but an important one. Obviously, within these museums, war is a dominant theme. It is the business of the organizations whose stories we tell, but it is not the sole purpose of our museum. This distinction requires, enables, and empowers a different approach, and I shall elaborate on this a little more as I go. So to begin with, and forgive me, I should have done this sooner, but I'm still not quite back in the swing of PowerPoints and slides and things, but here we go. So to begin with, it's important to place the presentation of war in museums in its proper context. There has been considerable scholarship on the representation of war in museums, and I've noticed some people who've contributed to scholarship are in this room, so it's fantastic to be able to share my thoughts with you. And questions have been asked and debates raised as to whether war can ever have a place in such a venue. There is no subject more divisive than war and conflict. Trust me, nobody gets this excited, agitated, or flat out angry about the shape and form of church spires, ecclesiastical steps, or art, for example, as they do about war and conflict and how that is presented to the public. It won't surprise you to hear that I undoubtedly do believe that war has a place in museums, but fortunately for my argument, so do many other scholars, all of whom are more impressive than me. Jay Winter, for example, wrote powerfully that, and I'll quote here, "Museums are the cathedrals of the 21st century, in that they have filled the void left by the conventional churches as a site in which mixed populations and different faiths, or no faith at all, of different origins and beliefs, confront and mediate on sacred themes, sacrifice, death, mourning, evil, brotherhood, dignity, transcendence. War not only belongs in museums, war dominates museum space in much of the public representation of history and will continue to do so." Ultimately, war and conflict is a fundamental part of our society and a catalyst for enormous change. As such, it is vital that it be reflected in the heritage landscape, and museums are the perfect place in which to do it. However, much of the discourse surrounding museums, war and museums, centers on either those museums that serve as national memorials to particular conflicts, such as the Imperial War Museum, or those that exist on battlefields themselves, Winter's sites of memory and mourning, for example. Indeed, Winter refers to museums as semi-sacred sites. Yet the museums he profiles are dedicated to the First and Second World Wars. Global conflicts involve the complete mobilizations of societies. Therefore, it's understandable for him to apply this idea about this dominance of war as a theme when you're looking at these events that really transcended the globe, led to the migrations of millions of people, the mobilization of civilian organizations and civilian bodies into military service and uniform. All of these are major factors in contributing to that, of course. Now, of course, as we know, however, the Falklands Malvinas serves as a bit of an outlier in that. It is, from a British perspective at least, it's a conflict fought by professional armed forces. There is no civilian conscription. This is a professional military that's been raised and trained for exclusively this purpose. And even then, it's only a small cadre of that British military that is deployed to the South Atlantic. So therefore, the level of experience and the popular expansion of it is much less. But also, it's the physical distance from the UK. When we think about the British experience of the First and Second World Wars, what dominates in British museum spaces, or has done for decades, is the experience on the Western Front. This is but essentially only a handful of miles from the south coast of England and a hop across the Channel, or it'd be the Blitz experience where London itself was directly attacked in the Second World War. The Falklands Malvinas, of course, is 8,000 miles from the UK, and also the fact of its short duration of just 74 days in comparison to 6 years of the Second World War, for example. All therefore potentially represent a challenge, a view through the same sort of context of national museums and memorials and conflict. However, a particular characteristic of the nature and history of the UK and its armed forces is that the majority of events represented in military museums, because of the campaigns the British armed forces fought, because of their role in things like the colonialism and the expansion of the British Empire, the vast majority of events that our military museums cover actually took place, as we say, over there or back then. There's not a huge amount of domestic military battlefields here in the UK that are commemorated in the wider sphere. And Jordan, since the First World War anyway, war and military museums have always functioned as a means of bringing the far away near. The far away meaning geographical, chronological, and emotional distance. And therefore, while the Falklands Malvinas certainly sits on the periphery, geographically and thematically, of British military history, it really does fit perfectly within this tradition of representation within UK military museums. Indeed, UK military museums are the natural vehicle for interpreting the Falklands conflict, a campaign waged beyond the horizon in military terms, but in a layperson's perspective, one that was fought at a distance of 8,000 miles in a part of the world where that evokes very little connection amongst the wider UK population. Indeed, were it not for the 1982 conflict, the vast majority of people in the UK would not even know where the Falklands is. Indeed, even at the outbreak of conflict, and we saw this, it was not uncommon for there to be considerable confusion amongst many in the British military task force being mobilised in response as to exactly how Argentina had managed to invade islands that they believed to be off the coast of Scotland. This is a dominant anecdote that often crops up, and in fact, it was even repeated in a documentary that was shown on television in the run-up to the 2nd of April recently. However, there are several challenges to presenting war in any museum environment. How can something so visceral and terrifying as war be presented in a public space without either removing too much of its character and effectively rendering it meaningless? Museums are highly sanitized and safe spaces. They are built, they're designed to be welcoming, to bring people in. And you're putting a horribly alien and uncomfortable experience into that, which presents a challenge. This is a real difficulty in the UK military museums in particular, are also visited predominantly by non-experts, civilians and families. I work for the Royal Air Force Museum. We welcome upwards of 700,000 visitors a year to both our sites. A tiny percentage of that served in the military. So therefore, the direct connection and that level of understanding and with an intellectual level with the collection is far lower than perhaps you might believe. The same was true of the National Army Museum when I was there, and exactly the same I know is true of the National Museum of the Royal Navy, and I know the Imperial War Museum, of course, again, also relies on these visitors. So whilst museums can be an authority on the experience of war as lived by those who endured it, they absolutely must behave in a certain way. James Scott has highlighted this challenge, but he also acknowledges that therefore some sanitization of the experience is inevitable. He writes, and I'll quote, "The balance here is between achieving a realistic view of war as being a violent thing and not causing offense by being too realistic, or by highlighting the violent activities carried out by the military. Veterans who have seen war do not want to re-experience past horrors, and the museum-going public do not want to be offended. It is not an overt attempt to create a positive view of war. It is merely a way of displaying the negative side in a safe manner." Of course, the flip side of this, and something we must also be conscious of, which is how can war be presented without transforming it into a xenophobic, voyeuristic experience, which many war museums created during conflict in the 20th century did, both wittingly and unwittingly. The rise of dark tourism is something that has really taken place, and there are quite fine lines between battlefield tours, experiences, and this concept of dark tourism, where people come for a voyeuristic experience that is overstimulated and takes you away from historical fact and historical representation. These are definitely something that, this remains a challenging issue for those of us working in museum environments that we must be sensitive to and questioning of. But of course, it's a challenge worth embracing, because museums have access and the opportunity to engage with thousands of visitors in a way that really no other public education platform can in particular. And I shall talk a little bit more about some of the benefits we've got there shortly. So moving on, having spoken about the people that we welcome briefly, I'd like to elaborate on that point. And certainly a challenge for any military museum is one of audiences. Museums are explicitly public places. They are sites of the public exchange of ideas and information. But there's an important distinction between the environment museum professionals work in and the world of academia, of deep research, of peer review, monographs, for example. This creates unique challenges for museums, but also unique opportunities. The reach of our museums is huge, and we're often able to act as a bridge, therefore, and work in partnership between the non-specialist public and academic historians, helping engage and support the intellectually curious and those interested in discovering more about a particular topic. But it's essential to understand that if we're going to understand how museums can approach the presentation of war. After all, museums are accountable directly to the public. They rise and fall on the success of attracting, engaging, and enthusing their visitors. They are either publicly funded and therefore must justify their funding, or they are reliant on visitor footfall for their revenue to keep their operations going. Either way, museums are essentially judged on their visitor numbers, and therefore they must be sensitive to their needs and expectations. However, for the museum audience, the wider, non-specialist public demand a well-known representation of war and conflict. They're not particularly hungry for a critical representation, a new idea, a study of the microcosm that is normally delivered through traditional academic research and publication. this is a key departure point of the academic theory and the museological practicality. While we are free to debate the theory and the presentation of war at length in a scholarly academic way, these debates often have very little cut through with museums, particularly those smaller institutions that do not benefit from state funding and derive a considerable portion of their income from admission charges. This creates a major challenge for museums. Museum audiences are diverse, composed of different people with different levels of knowledge, different expectations, motivations, and hope for outcomes of engaging with a museum exhibition. There is a value, there's an equal value in someone who enters a museum who is studying something academically, is a veteran, or to someone who's just looking for a day out with their children. This is a very real and true application of certainly of the UK heritage environment. So simply put, all these people do not come with a complete knowledge of every conflict that a museum might be presenting. Some do not know anything, nor do they particularly even want to know. Sometimes they are just interested in letting their children run loose in large open spaces, particularly if it's raining. A rainy day is a blessing day for a museum. So therefore, there are knowledge gaps certainly relating to the major global conflicts that are even on the school curriculum, such as the First and Second World Wars. And writing about these conflicts in particular, Winter has previously commented that war museums face a stark choice. Either they aim at an interrogation as to how war can be represented, or they continue to deepen lies and illusions about it. However, from the practical perspective, the reality is but more nuanced than that. While no museum will actively promote the lies and illusions, what we know from an academic perspective to be falsehoods can on occasion be quite hard to shift if they already have considerable public traction. Some of them are just generally hardwired into the British population and wider knowledge is lacking. We in the heritage sector also have to work to mobilise an interest amongst as many people as possible, but starting from a low ebb. This is true for the Falklands Malvinas, as for other better known conflicts, and that dedicates how we structure our information, what level of information we provide, how we write things like object labels, captions, how many words we use. All of these things are factored into these strategies. So I fully appreciate, as an academic, as a specialist, some people might visit museums and be frustrated at what they see as the lack of information, or perhaps a basic rendering of things that are designed to be accessible. Never dumbed down, but always accessible. But we have to appreciate the wider audience needs here. And the expert is a tiny minority of what we might see. We still believe there are things for experts to gain from museums, obviously. But at the same time, it's important that we make sure that everybody can still enjoy their day, regardless of what they're looking for. And I think we saw this with the First World War, in particular, the First World War centenary, which is an interesting comparison to the commemorative period we're entering now on the Falklands Malvinas. For example, in 2012, ahead of the centenary of the First World War, the organisation British Future found that 1 in 3 of the public could not name the year the war started. This is the major global conflict that is actually on the school curriculum as well. The British Council's report of 2014, Remember the World as Well as the War, showed that what knowledge there was of the conflict was again largely limited to the fighting on the Western Front. Now, in the UK, less than half of more than 1,000 people questioned in this survey were aware that North America and the Middle East were involved in that war, and less than a quarter were aware that Africa and Asia participated as well. Now, there are millions of people who are moving across the world. The First World War is referred to as a world war, not because of the theatres in which it takes place, but the numerous people coming across to fight and the migration and movement of populations. And as such, it was really key that was one of the knowledge gaps that we sought to try and tackle with our work around the First World War centenary. Now, significantly, the number of people that realised Indians, for example, played a role in the First World War had risen to 70% by the end of the centenary period. So, that more than tripled on previously. But this was the result of literally millions of pounds of investment at a pace that many thought might actually be counterproductive and lead to a war centenary weariness amongst the British population. That level of investment, that transformation and use of public spaces for art, of museum examples of grant making, of community projects, for example, just cannot be replicated across every conflict that the military museums choose to mark, particularly a conflict that only lasted 74 days. And as such, museums must pick their battles as to where they allocate their resources. Indeed, public knowledge in the UK of the Falklands Malvinas is not particularly good. I will say this. Recent research has exposed a strong demographic divide amongst any prospective audiences, and it found that, in fact, that 26% of those aged 18 to 24 had never even heard of the conflict, and that 47%.
Peter, excuse me, could you slow down a little bit because the interpreter has difficulties keeping up with your pace? Just a bit. It's really interesting, really excellent. Just a bit more slowly, if you could, please. Thank you.
Of course. I apologise. Sorry, everybody. I'll make that point again because it's quite a significant one. But so recent survey here found that 26% of those aged 18 to 24 had never heard of the conflict, the Falklands-Malvinas conflict, and that 47%, so nearly half, did not know in which decade it had taken place. Already, this therefore shows that any museum looking to represent the Falklands-Malvinas is going to face challenges in exactly how they go about communicating key information regarding it. Even amongst those who at least know something about the events of 1982, most likely because the conflict took place within their lifetime and within their living memory, there are also misconceptions and misunderstandings that have really been fomented since the conflict itself. These are undoubtedly clouded by some of the contemporary reporting that took place during that time. The way that the Falklands sits in the UK perspective is the Falklands is often referred to as the first television war here in Britain. And yet at the same time, it is probably, and this has been commented before, the worst reported war that Britain has participated in since the Crimea. The flow of information was extremely slow. It was heavily edited by the state authorities. It was redacted. It was not coming out in real time. And yet there were television pictures, there was radio broadcasts, there was a sort of a greater sense of a direct connection to the theatre of operations and what was taking place there. And so many people feel like they lived the conflict in real time. That in itself is a fascinating thing, that people feel they lived it, and yet all the evidence suggests they did not. Now, furthermore, on top of that, positive representations of the British Armed Forces, of their skill, of their professionalism, they accounted for 92% of the media coverage produced by the newspapers and the 2 BBC television channels in 1982. And as such, the idea that Britain was a military superpower, that they were fighting conscripts, when combined with knowledge that the conflict was short of the most, has created this idea that British victory was inevitable and therefore somehow easy. And this is not historically literate or accurate. Indeed, it was not inevitable that Britain would go to war in 1982, that they would engage in armed conflict. And as such, it is fascinating how this dominant narrative has been created in the decade since. Indeed, although the majority of the Argentine forces were conscripts who faced, there were regular forces there in particular, and you can chart their combat representation and combat performance. And this, even though they were conscripts, this did not automatically mean they would be defeated at all. As a member of 4-2 Commando Royal Marines who fought on Mount Harriet once said to me, even a girl guide with a bow and arrow can be dangerous if you're at the pointy end. So the Argentines were well armed. They were in strong defensive positions. They had the weather on their side. They were defending and not having to navigate miles and kilometers of harsh terrain out in the open. They fought bravely, and they had to be defeated by strength of arms in the field, through strength of arms in the field. To dismiss that, to proclaim the Argentine invasion futile because they were always going to lose, demeans all who fought, not just the Argentines, but also the British too. And this is a battle in the present that should be waged by museum professionals. We must push back on this idea, I think. And actually, when you look across what is taking place now, that is a unifying thought, which is for me pleasing to see. Now, another particular British myth of the Falklands conflict is again very significant, and it is that more veterans of the fighting have since taken their own lives since 1982 than were killed during the campaign itself. This was, when this claim was first made, it was headline news. You can see that on the left there. That's the carrying the claim in BBC News, and just one of the media outlets that did so. And it became entrenched an idea. And again, partly this because it wasn't until 2013 when government figures, and I accept that government figures are a contentious source, but they are the only data that was available, they were published, and they showed that this claim is simply not true. In fact, the available data shows that 95 deaths of Falklands veterans since the campaign were attributed to suicide. Some 7% of the total who passed away in the, as then, 31 years since the fighting had ended. This is significantly less than the number of deaths during the campaign itself. And the report also noted that for British Falklands veterans, and I shall quote this, for deaths due to intentional self-harm and events of undetermined intent, such as suicide, there was a 35% significant decreased risk of dying compared to the UK general population. So as such, the data suggests that those who'd fought in the South Atlantic were in fact more resilient and less likely to succumb to self-harm than their civilian peers were. But this is not the story that has been shared. And even after this news has been published, the previous myth remains. You know, having got there first, it's been quite difficult to shift. And again, it's something that I've already heard it repeated in the 40th anniversary period as well. And it's something that I think will need to be constantly pushed back to. And you know, coming back to Winter's point, it is the duty of museums to challenge such a myth. You know, but such a challenge, of course, has to be made sympathetically. There are undoubtedly many veterans of the Falklands and Malvinas on both sides who have suffered psychological injury as a result of their service. And thus, this is a myth that cannot be dismissed out of hand for the risk of offending or belittling the experiences of those who have suffered. Ultimately, museums cannot discard or dismiss these misconceptions easily. We cannot invite the public into the gallery spaces, which we essentially host and maintain and open for them, and then tell them that everything they know about something is wrong. However, the museum sector in the UK is fortunate that the British public are willing to visit and engage with museums. So this is a fight worth having, but we must just do it in a sensitive and effective way. You know, being confrontational in how we talk about this is not going to achieve what we want to. And as such, again, that limits and characterizes how we might present such information. So this leads on to my next point, which is the battle over narratives. Now, Clark and Washika, and apologies if I pronounced that terribly, have discussed war museums as sites of cultural diplomacy. But of course, there is no international consensus on the Falklands-Malvinas conflict. Since June 1982, there have been tensions and contestations in the history of it. In this, museums, in fact, continue to wage the conflict in their displays, either as active or passive participants. In the UK, there is a very simple narrative of the war. Argentina invades, and it's always termed an invasion, before Britain responds, achieves a victory, and the issue is, from a British perspective at least, closed. In Argentina, the narrative of the conflict is the polar opposite of that presented in the UK, and it also holds a radically different place in national consciousness and within national identities. In the UK, for example, the Falklands is but one conflict honoured on Armistice Day, 11th of November. And even then, the vast majority of Armistice Day is dedicated to the First World War, the Second World War. And in fact, this is a fascinating point in and of itself. Conflicts subsequent to 1945 have almost a diminished recognition amongst public representations of who veterans are and the conflicts in which they fought. And you know, in Argentina, though, in contrast, 2nd of April is Veterans Day, and public commemoration is linked directly to the Malvinas. And similarly, the narrative of the Malvinas that is but one phase of an ongoing dispute is woven into domestic culture at an intense level. You know, this is not a settled issue. For example, this is a slide here that shows a snapshot of memorials to the Malvinas and also associated schools. And you can see the one I've highlighted is, you know, Heroes of the Malvinas is the name of the school. You know, even given the difference in size between Britain and Argentina, you know, this is remarkable. You can see all the dots on the map through the various provinces there. You know, this is represented across the country, which I think is a very significant point. And also the map also uses the Argentine names for places on the Falkland Islands themselves that were in fact so contentious in 1982, such as Puerto Argentino, rather than Port Stanley with the anglicised version of or rather how it's called in the Anglophone world. The source of this map is the Museo Malvinas e Islas Atlántico Sur, a free government-supported museum. Now, the museum presents galleries on the region that include social and natural history, as well as, of course, the events of 1982. And it's these events that provide the overarching framework, even if they're not ostensibly the sole subject matter. Outside there is a public artwork combining a map of the Falklands Malvinas and the silhouette of the General Belgrano. You walk past one of the lifeboats from the Belgrano in the museum. This is a museum that contains a dominant theme, which is one of sovereignty over the South Atlantic islands. And that key point of sovereignty is underlined throughout the whole of the museum's operation. Indeed, it is part of the motto of the institution, which is peace, memory, and sovereignty, paz memoria et soberania. The museum claims the narrative on behalf of all the Argentine people and uses the conflict to anchor that, to represent that, to present the public face, the agreed consensus. Now, for Argentina, the question of sovereignty is open, a live issue that requires ongoing diplomatic engagement. This takes us right back to Resolution 2065 of the UN in 1965 about finding a solution for this. Again, the fact that the idea of the conflict would go back that far is something that is very sparsely covered in UK military museums. Most UK military museums will begin their displays about the Falklands Malvinas on the 2nd of April, perhaps with a reference to previous discussions, but they won't cover that in such detail. Whereas sovereignty, obviously, for Argentina remains the main issue to be discussed. In fact, on 2nd of April of this year, the Guardian here in the UK carried an opinion piece from the Argentine foreign minister to this effect. However, from a UK perspective, there is no issue over sovereignty to be discussed. For the British, the governing principle in any discussions is that of self-determination. Famously, the Falklanders want to be British. We saw that expressed in their 2013 referendum on a vote whose result was, again, extensively reported in the UK press. 99.8% of the islanders voted to remain a British territory, with only 3 votes again. In the British mindset, this renders any ongoing discussions as unnecessary. It has to be said that the conflict simply does not resonate in Britain as to the same level in Argentina. And I say this as someone who studied this extensively as part of my professional career. There is no UK museum of the conflict. The Falklands isn't even taught on our school curriculum here, which explains some of the figures I described earlier about the lack of wider knowledge. And in fact, some of the Argentine efforts to maintain their claim are viewed in the UK with a mixture of disbelief, mockery, and suspicion. And sometimes that is distastefully covered in either the tabloid press or perhaps in television programs as well. There is no sensitivity to the Argentine position on this in wider popular discourse. Of course, the other contentious areas is the specific terminology used to describe the events of 1982. And I realise as I've been speaking that I've been guilty of some of these myself. From the UK perspective, legally, it was not a war, as there was no formal declaration. However, within the UK context, the phrases war and conflict are used almost interchangeably in some institutions and outlets. And I realise I've made the same mistake myself talking, so you can see how easy it is to slip into this. This nuance is not a default. Partly this is because English language scholarship offers no real clarity or solution. Friedman, for example, in his official history, calls it the campaign in the title of the official history, but he subtitles the first volume of that as the origins of the Falklands War. Similarly, many media outlets call it the Falklands War. It was referred to as a war in Parliament at the time in 1982 as well. And referring back to my point about public perceptions, if the media are referring to it as a war, then this is a term that will be most widely adopted by the public at large. At what point do museum professionals accept that and incorporate it, or push back on this and waste precious capacity that could be used to encourage people to visit or learn more? That is a serious question for us when we, again, are weighing up how we approach the topic. A further question on the issue of narratives is those which are shown in museums and which are lacking either through deliberate or accidental exclusion. Because the Falklands is represented in many military museums across the UK, there is a considerable level of parochialism in how these stories are told. The UK military museum landscape is fragmented. It's divided along regional and specialism lines. My museum, for example, is the National Museum of the Royal Air Force. we do not have the collection to tell the story of the Falklands-Malvinas conflict through any perspective other than the RAF. The same logic is applied to the Royal Marines Museum, the Fleet Air Arm Museum, the Gurkha Museum, the Household Cavalry Museum, and so on. Whereas the Airborne Assault Museum will tell the story of the Parachute Regiment. They will focus on the battles of Goose Green, Longdon, Wireless Ridge, whereas Scots Guards, the Guards Museum, will focus possibly on as their sole representation of the Falklands in their displays on the Battle for Tumbledown. That's their specific battle honour. I think this is also true in Argentina. However, there are Malvinas-related displays beyond the Museo Malvinas at Islas del Atlántico Sur, and as such, it can be challenging to find a single, all-encompassing view of the campaign in one solitary museum. Now, the voice missing from a lot of British displays is that of the Argentines, in particular. Historically, the representation inclusion of the enemy in UK military museums has always been a challenge. And in 1948, it was commented that military museums only showed artifacts relating to themselves, their own side, and that was it. And attempts have been made to include the enemy in displays, to humanize them. We've seen a lot of that in some particular European institutions connected to the First World War. But they've often taken the form of captured trophies or equipment. And the legacy of such an approach means that enemy material presented in military museums can come across as triumphalist, even if it's not its intention. While audiences can respond positively to the opportunity to compare and contrast the material culture of belligerents, it is difficult to divorce the presentation of the enemy as enemies as being anything other than as trophies collected from a vanquished foe. The same applies to the Falklands-Malvinas. There is no shortage of Argentine military equipment in British military displays, but is often used to underline the British victory rather than being displayed on an equal footing. Of course, another voice missing from the narrative of British military museums is that of the Falkland Islanders themselves, who endured occupation on whose behalf the war was fought. While the Falkland Islands Museum and National Trust displays their own heritage and history, these stories do not often migrate the 8,000 miles to the UK displays on the conflict. So moving on to collections, which are the bedrock of any museum. I've already highlighted some of the differences between academic study of the conflict and museum activity. But what museums do is they amass, they collect, they display material culture relating to the specific subject matter. Museums rely on their collection, the physical stuff, as these are what their visitors come to see. They do not read books, or the visitors, do not read books or academic treatises on the walls. They come to see and be surrounded by links to past events. This means that if you have the collections, you can tell the story, but if you don't, you cannot. The gap cannot be represented by anything else. Fortunately, the Falklands-Malvinas conflict is well represented in museum collections across the UK, but the presence of these items does not guarantee their display. In fact, far from it. On average, across the British museum sector, only around 1% of any museum's collection is on display at any one time. 1%. The British Museum, for example, displays 80,000 objects. Sounds like a lot, but they have 8 million in their collection. Of the RAS Museum collection, for example, of 1.3 million objects, less than 1% is on display. And of items relating specifically to the Falklands, this is 0.4%. The National Art Museum in London holds approximately 1,500 objects relating to the Falklands-Malvinas in its collection. And of these, around 2.2% are on display, which is double the national average, so quite impressive, but again, still relatively small. Now, some of these numbers may seem shocking, but they are logical. From an RAF perspective, for example, the Falklands conflict of 74 days is less than 0.2% of its history. Furthermore, 75% of the RAF Museum collection relates to the Second World War, which in itself, while only about 5% of its history, represents a time when the RAF was at its largest. And in a wider context, the Second World War is a major touchstone within British culture, of which there is greater recognition, greater mobilization and desire to engage with too. So it is natural that that's the case. And collections are not uniform by topic. They are the result of a host of outside forces, such as availability, financial cost, subjective curatorial choices, and perceptions of public want. As Bunia and Stiliano Lambert have noted, museums may hold authentic pieces of the past, but these are organized, arranged, and set in place as a result of a complex network of personal, social, political, and economic circumstances and decisions. There are also challenges, of course, in the nature of the collections. A museum's collection varies from large to small objects, anything from a medal or letter upwards. For example, the RS Museum, as part of our drive to commemorate the Falklands activity and displays, acquired that Chinook helicopter this year and have put on display. And it is big. It is big, let me tell you. And as you can see there, this is it in pieces before we rebuilt it in a hangar. And you can see on the left there the very technical way in which we try and plan our displays, which is what have we got to take out that we can then put in, and how are we going to get people to be able to see it. But that is a typical display hangar, and as you can see, put in a Chinook and a Harrier GR3 to represent the Falklands occupies a significant portion of my display space. And I've had to take other aircraft off display to do that. I've had to disassemble aircraft, put them into store, which obviously takes time. Furthermore, as well, other museums simply cannot do this. If you look at the Museum of the Royal Navy, they cannot display a warship that served in the Falklands because none have survived. None have passed into a museum collection. They've either been sold off or scrapped. And this is, I think, a key thing for how we talk about how we represent this material culture. Other museums, the Museum of the Royal Marines, for example, who played such a significant part from the British perspective, is currently closed. They cannot display their collection. And so they are, not only are they missing an opportunity to promote themselves, the public are deprived of an opportunity to learn more about it. However, I will say that these are wonderful collections. The public responds to them fantastically, and so it's whilst it's a challenge, it's certainly a good one to have. So I'd also like to talk about the question of resources. I highlighted a little bit there, which is essentially around time, cost, expertise, and the funding you might have. We're very fortunate in our museum to be supported by the UK government, which means that we are able to embark on ambitious projects. But even we have a limit on what we can do. I will say mounting special exhibitions is intensive in terms of staff labor and financial outlay, and they require enormous efforts to be successful. It's a whole team effort across museums. If you look for one example of a recent gallery exhibition opening of the Imperial War Museum, they unveiled their Second World War and Holocaust galleries in 2021, a project that cost them more than £30 million. Now, it goes without saying that this budget is beyond all but a handful of museums, and the infrastructure exhibitions require, be they showcases, graphic panels, monitors, can also be extremely expensive. Now, when it comes to the Falklands Malvinas, there has been a drive to produce special exhibitions. While there is no set time on how long a special exhibition needs to be installed for, it can be anything from a few weeks to 12 months or more. It does need to be proportionate to the amount of effort that goes into producing it. Those exhibitions that are larger in scale and ambition will have longer opening times. Yet, as the conflict itself was only 74 days long, there is the potential for any special exhibition to last longer than the events it commemorates. And this is not in and of itself a problem, but it is a strategic decision that museums have to make. Similarly, the amount of effort that is dedicated to such an exhibition alongside other projects the museum may be running at the same time needs to be addressed. It's a question of proportionality, essentially. As I highlighted here on the slide, there's a question of expertise. The staff in military museums, like all academics, have particular areas. These can be broad and varied, but they simply may not extend to the Falklands Malvinas. Just as collections can be the products of subjective choices motivated by the personal interest of curators, so can the projects that they undertake. I have driven a lot of our Falklands 40 activity here at the RF Museum because it is a particular interest of mine. I'm not to say I'm solely responsible for it, but at the same time, had there not been someone with that same level of interest, someone who might perhaps be interested in something else, operations in Malaya or something like that, or the Berlin airlift, that may be where the center of gravity fell and the major effort lay. So it's important to sort of appreciate that from a human level. Thankfully, though, none of these challenges are insurmountable. They're simply part of the decision-making process. What is fascinating is the way in which museums have responded, which I'll now share some examples of and highlight some dominant themes. First, obviously, to talk about my own museum, it'd be remiss of me not to. There are, special exhibitions can be, as I said, complicated. They can be expensive and difficult. And actually, what we've seen or what I've seen from surveying the landscape here in the UK, is that there's been a drive to augment displays, to perhaps use new acquisitions to bring in new displays or bring things out of stores to put them on display again, sort of mini exhibitions rather than full-blown special exhibitions. This is true of us at the RAF Museum. We to mark the acquisition of Bravo November, the famous Chinook from the campaign, we brought our Harrier GR3 out, and we've used that to create a Falklands cluster in our Cosford site, and alongside elsewhere where we already have a Vulcan and a Victor aircraft that took part in the Black Buck missions too. And Falklands 40 has enabled us to draw attention to our new acquisitions but our existing collection, and to motivate new visitors and those who might have visited before but might be motivated to return by the wider coverage. We've also created a digital trail that guides visitors around our site and which can be accessed from home. The RAF Museum actually has 2 sites, and while the majority of our Falklands Malvinas aircraft based at Cosford, again highlighting the challenges some museums have when it comes to displaying collections, we have some smaller material culture at our London site, but also the chapel from Stanley Airfield, so pointing to the legacy of the campaign as well. And similarly down there, we've created a digital trail too. We're also uploading new content to our website in the form of blogs, and have tailored our RAF Stories platform to give prominence to those veterans that served in the conflict. You can see that here. We run essentially it's an oral history program that we do, and we are using it, as you can see there, in the bottom left-hand corner. We are actually asking people if they have a Falkland story they'd like to share with us as well. We're using this as a call to arms to further develop our collection as well. We are using this as an opportunity to better inform people within the UK of the role the RAF played in the Falklands Malvinas. We are ourselves competing against the recognition given to the Army and the Royal Navy in this campaign. But it has also been a manageable and proportionate level of activity, given the museum is also engaged on a major redevelopment with 2 new permanent exhibitions being planned within the next 18 months on our London site, and also a complete redesign of our Cosford hangars too. Now, elsewhere, it would be remiss of me certainly not to highlight some of the good work being done by my colleagues in other institutions. There are special exhibitions planned, some which you can see here. Tangmere, for example, the poster there in the centre, like us, showcasing a new acquisition, in their case a Sea Harrier that served, as well as drawing attention to other collections they have connecting to the conflict. But what is also interesting is that there are a number of special exhibitions that are based around art and photography happening. These are, as a rule, easier and cheaper exhibitions for institutions to mount and put on than those including 3D material, but they can be just as impactful. So it's a great way of engaging people. The National Memorial Arboretum, for example, that's in the top left there, Falklands 40 sketches from the front line, exhibiting sketches by the war artist Linda Kitson, whose work can also be seen in the Imperial War Museum. You can see the IWM's note there about what they're doing, which is essentially augmenting their own displays, but also putting on a photography exhibition too at their London site. Similarly, the Fleet Air Arm Museum on the right-hand side have refreshed their Falklands displays. They've taken the opportunity of the 40th anniversary to do that, but also they're exhibiting photographs as a new thing to try and motivate people to come and see. The enhanced use of digital storytelling by museums is a positive legacy of the COVID pandemic, where widespread closures moved much of our activity online. Museums have established audiences and grown in confidence and using digital platforms. The Museum of Army Flying, for example, there on the left, they're doing their activity exclusively online. Falklands War 40th anniversary online exhibition. There on the right, that is the National Museum of the Royal Navy. They are contributing sort of a series of blogs and updates of key figures, key stats, impact, informing people in a sort of bite-sized way. Digital is often used as an opportunity to offer more than what can be placed in a physical space, to also offer permanency and accessibility beyond the museum site. However, it is not always an answer. It is beyond what most audiences think of being as an exhibition, which remains, to their mind, a physical experience. It is also not always easily discoverable. It can and should be used to augment physical displays, but is ultimately no substitute for them. Now, alongside all this, of course, there is an extensive public programme being offered by museums, ranging from lectures, conferences, special collections, access events, and commemorative events as well. As a scholar of the Falklands Malvinas and a museum professional, it really is wonderful to see so much going on in the coming months, and some ways in which my colleagues in the sector are taking these stories to the public. So I'll just begin to wrap up, as I'm conscious of time and your patience in listening, particularly for those doing so as a second language. In summary, when it comes to the commemoration activity in military museums, there are strengths and there are weaknesses of different approaches. The strengths are your benefits and ability to educate a wider audience. You can engage with a younger audience in a more effective and direct way, perhaps than academic historians can. You can shape the agenda. You can drive this and make people look at things in a way they might not have been expecting. Our outstanding collections, repositories of memory mean that museums can remain leading authorities in the field. We do not have to be passive partners in this world. And we're, of course, very lucky here in the UK that museums are much loved and respected institutions. So there are challenges. We must respond to the public and engage with popular myths, occasionally even when people are wrong. There are limitations on what can be displayed, of course, and that there can be challenges in resource and activity. However, none of these are insurmountable. They apply to the Falklands Malvinas as they do to any other conflict. They simply need to be approached and tackled in the same sort of way. So, in conclusion, exhibiting the Falklands Malvinas in UK military museums is not a straightforward process. There are challenges and opportunities, and for professionals working within these institutions, it is a question of picking their battles, of targeting resources where they have the most effect, the Schwerpunkt, and this is no different from any other conflict, as I've said. However, museums are able to operate in unique ways, achieving significant public impact based on a public willing to engage with their unique collections. They are a crucial component of the landscape of memory and will continue to be so. But I'll close on a final point as well. The commemoration of the Falklands Malvinas is not something that has only taken place in this anniversary period. This is a lived experience and continues to feature in the daily life in both the Falklands and Argentina and here in the UK as well. And the same is true of our military museums. Many of these displays are permanent. There may be greater emphasis put on them during this period, but actually they're permanent exhibitions anyway. And that while there may be targeted specific headline activity during this and other activity within a calendar year, is not the only time that it takes place. There is no time limit or time frame in which to work. Many of our displays on the conference are open all year round and thrive on your visits. So please do go out and visit the museums. Thank you very much, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this fascinating look behind the scenes of a museum professional. I'm sure there will be questions, and I would like to hand over to Rosal at this point, who will manage the Q&A.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. It was fascinating. We learned a lot, especially about the competing demands from a museum professional. I know there will be lots of questions, but this is also part of a wider conference. So Tillman, if you can help me with timekeeping, if we need to move on, do please let me know. I can see we have some questions already coming in. One from Malcolm Evans, who asks, doesn't the fact that the real horror of war for those directly in the line of fire is taboo, something people need to be protected from, make the whole sector a massive sanitizing and normalizing operation? I'll probably take two questions together just to allow you to elaborate a bit more. We have a question as well from Cora. Perhaps you can unmute yourself. Cora Garmarnik.
Mi pregunta es si vos conocés, Peter, si hay alguna política de devolución de materiales que han sido requisados a los soldados argentinos después de la rendición. Sé que hay fotos personales, objetos personales, libretas, diarios íntimos que ellos llevaban durante la guerra, que quedaron en manos inglesas. Tengo entendido que hay material de ese en el museo. Te quería preguntar si sabes de alguna negociación con el gobierno argentino de devolución de esos materiales.
Thank you very much for that. So I'll answer that question first, if that's all right. The simple answer is no. I do not know of any formal government process or policy around this issue. The subject of the repatriation of museum collections is something that UK museums are becoming more aware of and sensitive to. We have a policy in each individual museums. I can say that with confidence because I wrote the one at the RF Museum and I wrote the one at the National Army Museum when I worked there, about how we will listen to requests for repatriation from foreign governments around particular collections items. When I was at the National Army Museum, we repatriated a lock of hair from the Emperor Theodoros, who had fought the British in Abyssinia in the late 19th century in a colonial campaign. The Ethiopian government had made a request for that to be returned, which we were happy to work with and do. In the UK context, repatriation, and I think actually perhaps in the wider European context, actually, repatriation of items is very much something that we are looking at a lens through a colonial perspective rather than one of conflict, direct military conflict. So the majority of cases so far have been involved in the repatriation of cultural property to former colonies that have since become independent. Now, that is not to say that perhaps this is the next step in how we engage with these collections. One of the images I showed you in the collections is a letter that's in the collection of the National Army Museum, is a letter that was collected on the battlefield that was written by a school child in Argentina to an Argentine soldier serving on the islands that was collected. The other materials which is hosted is there are things like that in museum collections. There's a lot of firearms and weapons, captured equipment, kit, these sorts of things as well. But a lot of that material has made its way into UK collections, and as such, I'm not aware of any that has been subject to requests. However, I do know that there is a capacity for the British government and the Argentine government to work together effectively. If you look at the identification of the war dead, for example, that has taken place, this is an opportunity whereby I think 40 years on, we can begin a sense of cultural rapprochement and begin to come together, I think, to create a more positive future about the past. And certainly, you know, we would be willing to discuss any of this, as I'm sure my colleagues in other museums would be as well. To go back to the first question about, you know, is this whole thing just a giant sanitization of a horrible event? To some extent, yes, it is. But the alternative is that we just don't talk about it, and that we leave the experience of war as being confined purely to those who've lived it. And therefore there is no public education about this. There's therefore no public understanding about this. These are horrible things. This is not about glorifying conflict at all. It enables us as a society to learn and to respond. And that, you know, that is a very important part of public discourse, I think. So yes, I absolutely take the point that we simply cannot replicate or recreate. And it would be horrible to even try and do so. And yet war is a dominant part of our lives. You know, I'm sure many other people have seen the horrible images that come out of Ukraine and conflicts elsewhere in the Yemen. This happens. And the only way we can appreciate and understand it is by learning about it through our own connected experience in museums. So I do take the point, but I also think it's important that we continue to do this and engage with this subject in museum environments.
Thank you very much. We have been informed that we have just about 9 more minutes left. So if you do have questions, please get them in as if you can. There was an early question from Cara Leve, I think it is. She asked a question that I think you've addressed already about the debates about the exhibitions from the Malvinas and Falklands conflict and its interrelationship with other debates about colonialism. So you've touched on that before, but maybe you can say a bit about whether that discussion about the repatriation of colonial artifacts has somehow influenced the debate about the repatriation of war trophies and those types of collections.
I think it's certainly a part of a wider trend of greater cultural sensitivity to how we present these objects. There is a far broader understanding that this history is contentious, and in some ways this comes back to my point I was making about audiences. Where there was in previous decades, there was assumed a sort of homogeneity around an audience, that everyone wanted the same thing. we are now in museums far more sensitive to people's individual backgrounds and ideas, and we try and moderate ourselves and present things in a way that is going to be as engaging as possible without necessarily alienating people. It might be that we need to moderate elements of our activity about how we do things. It might be that actually we need to create a greater understanding about what we are doing and how we do so. But I certainly think the idea about of repatriation is something that is something we are all attuned to across the sector. We are talking about this regularly. We are redesigning policies that allow us to revisit this in a way that we didn't before. The concept of war trophies is a particularly interesting one, and I think that is something that would probably bear a greater discussion. I think we could perhaps have an entire session on this in and of itself. But it's certainly something that I would be interested in tracking more as it develops. I won't pretend that I have all the answers. I have a few theories and thoughts as a practitioner. But when we look at examples of this, there are contentious, there are points of conflict between us, between certain nations, for example, that still exist, and there are plenty of collections relating to some very close alliances between nations that exist in other museums' military collections. For example, we have a French eagle captured at Waterloo that I'm sure the Musée de l'Armée might like to have in Invalides, but is in the National Army Museum. Similarly, the National Army Museum has colours taken from the War of 1812 from Washington that they might like back. They've got colours from the British Army in the War of Independence that they might like back. But these things are, there are pieces of aircraft that shot down over Germany in German military museums as well, and vice versa. So these exist in collections. We can't pretend they don't. But it's not yet something we've got around to discussing. So I'm really fascinated by that question. It's something I shall certainly take away and think more of, and I'd be really fascinated to hear from anybody else who does have any thoughts or ideas on that.
Definitely. Great. Thank you very much. One of our panelists, Mirtha Amati, has a question, so I'll invite them to unmute and ask. And in the meantime, there's a question in Spanish in the Q&A.
Yo que soy Mirta, buenos días.
Buenos días.
Bien, yo tenía dos preguntas. Una tiene que ver, con este concepto que vos trabajás de diplomacia cultural. ¿Cómo eso efectivamente llega? Porque la diplomacia tiene en cuenta en general las distintas perspectivas. Y lo que solemos ver es que en los distintos museos aparece la perspectiva de cada nación. Por otro lado, también esta cuestión de las narrativas, ¿no? Si sigue existiendo esa narrativa triunfalista y guerrera, o si sigue existiendo esa narrativa para criticarla, es decir, que aparezca otro posicionamiento, y en ese sentido también, cuánto se trabaja en Gran Bretaña con las corrientes que vienen desde los años 70, de la museología crítica, la nueva museología, si se plantea la autoridad compartida, o si los museos siguen siendo muy tradicionales, ¿no? Porque Europa en muchos museos avanzó en esto, probablemente más en los museos de arte que en los museos militares, no lo sé, es una pregunta, y después la última en relación a los públicos, ¿no? Si diferencian entre el público británico, si los isleños o los que vivían en las islas que ahora están viviendo en Gran Bretaña lo visitan, si ahí hay diferencias, y después si trabajan con el público argentino, todas las argentinas y los argentinos que tenemos conocidos que fueron a Inglaterra, es un impacto fuerte ver en los museos, yo no fui, ver en los museos, esto que recién también Cora comentaba, ¿no? Objetos que uno se pregunta de quién es la propiedad, quién tiene autoridad sobre esos objetos y sobre todo sobre el relato, ¿no? Para no sacralizar los objetos, la posibilidad que tendría es de esto, de participar del relato y la narrativa sobre esos objetos. Si esas voces es imposible que aparezcan en la muestra, y si es así, si encuentran otros espacios, porque a veces se pueden hacer encuentros, reuniones como este en el que vos estás participando, pero que se visibiliza menos en tu institución, y más en las nuestras. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. So I think it's a really interesting question. And I think in some ways, this is where the Falklands Malvinas sits on a bit of a periphery and perhaps longer down the line. There has been cultural rapprochement of military museums, but they've been driven by, from a British perspective, they've been driven by large-scale the large-scale conflicts, particularly of the 20th century. In this way, museums have become sites of cultural diplomacy in certain ways, an opportunity to present a view, and it's not necessarily the dominant, it doesn't always claim to be the dominant view, but a view of the past, or it creates a space in which people and our visitors can ask questions and offer their own opinions on that. You've seen there is a increase in sensitivity around the display of captured or foreign equipment in museum displays. You will see in the Imperial War Museum, for example, a large display in the Imperial War Museum in their new Second World War galleries has been about displaying the global war. So bringing other people in, bringing other perspectives in. So they have Chinese, Japanese, German, Russian, American, British, all of these equipments is shown in their gallery space. And that's a conscious editorial choice that they have made. In terms of that sort of community curation, it is something that museums have begun to do. And I think that it's not necessarily something that has happened with material culture relating to the Falklands Malvinas, but that's not to say it's not something that should, and it's perhaps something that could. And I think is where we look at how this sits within the wider hierarchy. This is very much something I would be interested in doing in future. I would be very interested in hearing from an Argentine perspective. I think, again, perhaps because in London and the UK, where our institutions are, the majority of our visitors who come and either to learn and focus about our First or Second World War collections, for example, are European. And as such, it's created a bow wave and a momentum to do this. So perhaps that is just the next step for us to use our museum spaces to discuss these things around this conflict as well. I've hopefully shown you how this is the same as any other conflict in military museums, and I don't see why that wouldn't also carry over to this. On the subject of triumphalism, there can be an element of that. I can say from my own perspective, both here at the RAF Museum and also when I worked at the National Army Museum, we specifically try to avoid a sense of triumphalism in our displays, conscious that the people who come and visit our international audience might not feel the same way about these things. So instead, we tried to present things as honestly as we could without being didactic to allow them to respond. That varies from culture to culture. I have been in museums whereby there is a heavily triumphalist view. The Great Patriotic War Museum, you walk across a field of iron crosses when you enter. That is surrounded by things captured in Berlin in 1945. South Korea, in their war museum there, has a very obviously triumphalist view because it is about resisting in a war that basically hasn't ended actually either. And so they have so really these things vary from culture to culture, and it is not for me to judge that in anything else. All I can speak for is from a British perspective, and I can say that the dominant current now is to try and remove that wherever possible as we approach. But similarly, where a lot of these collections lie in regimental history museums, there is always going to be a sense of pride because these are the things created by that family. That's how that is a founding principle of the culture of that organization. And therefore they have a slightly different perspective on perhaps some of the bigger or national museums or local museums. So it's a classic historian's answer in that it depends, but hopefully that has answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for responding so fulsomely to these questions. There are actually more questions, but unfortunately we'll have to wrap us up our wonderful interpreter. We have to give him a bit of a break now. So I'll just wrap up by thanking you again for this really wonderful talk. Personally, I learned so much from your reflections. And yes, the conference continues.